This block originally contained lots numbers 1 through 4. These lots were owned by early families like Preston, Bell, Amos, and Helms. By 1875, 4 large buildings were constructed along Main Street, including the Henderson House, built in 1850, Dr. Conway's house and office, built around 1871, a store building in 1875, and the Thomas Roberts Black store building in 1850. Unfortunately, none of these structures still stand today. The Henderson House hosted different businesses, including the Green Hotel, where the National Bank of Blacksburg first opened when it was chartered in 1891. Alexander Black served as its first president and remained the president until his death in 1935. The building was torn down in the 1960s to build the Town Center building that still stands today. In 1890, Alexander Black was involved in several different goods businesses, including Alexander Black & Company, Black & Payne, and Black & Logan. Today, a modern clothing store, Mad Dog, occupies the original Alex Black building. In 1920, construction began on a new building at the corner of Main and Roanoke Streets. It originally housed the second site of the National Bank of Blacksburg and has continued to be the home of many different businesses throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Currently, at the corner of Draper and Roanoke, the Blacksburg Farmers Market bustles with regular markets and events throughout the year. Before the farmers market was built in 2009, 2 private residences stood along Roanoke Street. Families including Helms, Price, Dobbins, and Preston originally owned land on this block. Situated at the corner of Roanoke and Main Streets, the Bedell House, also known as the Amos Tavern and A.W. Lustern Tavern, was a prominent landmark in town. Originally built around 1830 by Edwin Amos, it is recorded to be the 3rd brick house built in Blacksburg. Amos ran a general store out of the building from 1833 to 1872. From 1928 to 1939, the town used it as an office building. In 1941, it was torn down and replaced with the Art Deco National Bank of Blacksburg building that still stands today. Between 1875 and 1880, the Christ Episcopal Church was built at the corner of Jackson and Church Streets. It is rumored to be the first structure to use a locally quarried limestone known today as Hokie Stone. Running along Church Street from the corner of Roanoke, a long building called Liebrook Row, also known as Hell's Row, was built in 1870. Early VAMC students lived here before sufficient housing was built on campus. At the end of the row, facing Church Street, the Liebrook House was built in the early 19th century. The building was used as the parish house from 1921 to 1935, when it was then torn down to make way for church expansion. This block is the most historically preserved in the entire 16 squares. Main buildings only exist on the perimeter of the block as a result of the original building standards set when the town was founded. Each block was divided into 4 equal lots. Each lot owner was required to build their homes on the exterior corner to ensure there would be enough space for gardens and livestock. As a result, new buildings and homes were built in the fill-in spaces between existing structures. 3 out of 4 original log cabins remain on the corners of this block, although they are hard to recognize with their many additions. The Croy-Dawson House was built in 1840 and kept in the same family for nearly 160 years. The boxwoods on the property are said to have been transplanted from Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. One of the most important features of this block was the town spring. One of 3 main springs in the 16 squares, the town spring supplied Blacksburg residents and VPI students alike. Mr. John B. Goodrich owned lots 6 and 8 in 1828 when the town spring was first mentioned. Goodrich dedicated the spring for the use and benefits of the citizens of Blacksburg, though with restrictions, including that no one may bathe themselves or any particle of clothing within the boundary of the lot, but may only take water from the spring in clean vessels. In 1890, members of the Virginia Agricultural Mechanical College requested that the town spring be shut down due to their belief that it was the source of all typhoid fever in town. A year later, a livery stable up the hill from the spring was removed and the spring reopened. Unfortunately, the spring would begin to decline until the 1940s, when it would become nothing more than a weed patch. A modern store building was constructed on the site of the town spring, which housed an A&P, a Kroger, and now the Virginia Tech bookstore. By the 1870s, businesses lined this block along Main Street, including Joe Linkous' store and house, John Spickard's harness shop, and Dyerly's hack and post office, all of which no longer stand today. In 1852, 17 charter members started a Baptist church. Throughout their history, they built several churches, including this church, built in 1940. The Baptists sold the building to the Church of God in 1953, but it was completely destroyed by fire in 1958. Today, a building of much less historical significance occupies the site. Located at the corner of Lee and Main Streets, the Cabo Fish Taco building was originally built in 1847 as the Presbyterian Church. On the facade, you will notice what remains of 2 separate entrances, one for men and one for women. The Presbyterian congregation initially shared this meeting place with the Methodists. It was built for $1,500 and is the oldest structure to survive along Main Street. At the corner of Roanoke and Main Streets, what is believed to be the first brick building in town was constructed in the early to mid-1800s, but was gone by the early 20th century. The Brown Brothers store building was built on this site in 1924. Today, most of the original building survives and houses a medical center. In 1904, a Presbyterian church was built along Roanoke Street. The church and its parsonage, built in 1907, still stand today. The church was originally the site of the W.G. Sarvey House. A Samuel Black built a house beside the Presbyterian church site in 1806. It stood through sometime in the late 1800s. Matt Grissom's livery stable was torn down in the 1890s after a typhoid fever outbreak. The site is now occupied by the Presbyterian Sunday School, built in 1924. The First Baptist Church constructed a building at the corner of Roanoke and Church Streets in 1885. During the Civil War, the building fell into disrepair and was torn down. In 1870, a second Baptist church was erected, which was used until 1903. In 1912, the current structure was built on the foundation of the 1903 structure. The Adam Croy House was built along Church Street in 1819 and stood through the early 1900s. Some debate circles the construction of the Third Methodist Church. Some sources state it was built in 1846, while others say 1860. However, the building was demolished in 1905, where the current Wisner Building, constructed in 1906, still stands. Roughly at the corner of Lee and Church Streets, one of the first buildings constructed in Blacksburg, a meeting house, was built in the early to mid-1800s, sited at the center of the 16 squares. It was shared by the Methodists and Presbyterians. The blocks in this area of the 16 squares, between Lee and Jackson Streets, were sometimes considered a town within a town. The Croy family owned most of these lots and ran several businesses out of their homes. In the mid to late 1800s, there were 4 houses built by members of the Croy family on this block: the Davidson Croy House, the Jack Croy House, the Dan Croy House, and the only remaining structure, the Andy Croy House. 3 of these houses lined Roanoke Street and have been replaced with early 20th century homes. This block features Alexander Black's first home, built in 1850, which was situated near the center of the block along Main Street. When Alexander's home burned completely to the ground in a fire, he replaced the home with a grand Queen Anne Victorian. It is believed the house spent a brief time as a boarding home after his death in 1935. Then, the home served as a funeral home until 2002, when the town of Blacksburg purchased the home and had it moved across Draper Road to save it from demolition. Today, the house serves as a cultural center and houses the main offices of the Blacksburg Museum and Cultural Foundation. Also constructed in 1850, the Amis Hotel sat at the corner of Washington and Main Streets. The Blacksburg Inn, also known as the Tutwiler Hotel, replaced the Amis Hotel and burned down in 1927. One of the earliest structures on this site was the Elizabeth Amis House, no longer standing, at the corner of Lee and Main Streets. Built in the 1850s, Dr. Harvey Black's house stood at the corner of Washington and Main Streets, the current site of Mellow Mushroom. In 1823, Wesley Argabright built a house along Lee Street. In the mid-1800s, George Turnell built a house along Church Street. Neither of these homes stand today. In the late 19th century, the town council had W.N. Gray build a small brick calaboose, or a jail, at the corner of Washington and Church Streets. The building was gone by 1921. In the 1870s, only 3 structures seem to have been built on this lot. Along Penn Street, the Monroe Evans house once stood. The basement of the house is believed to have served as an armory during the Civil War. Located on the opposite side of the block, the Camper House, built by at least 1870, is still standing. The third building is unidentified, but located along Washington Street. Today, this block contains a few houses and apartment buildings. Early owners of these lots included the Amis, Rutledge, and Peterman families. In 1921, the Rutledge-Peterman Hotel was built at the corner of Washington and Main Streets. From 1841 to 1853, John Peterman ran the hotel. In 1876, W.T. Gitt, who ran a hotel in Newport, moved his Gitt House to Blacksburg. He moved to Christiansburg after less than a year in Blacksburg, but the Gitt House was captured in this 1870s photo of Main Street. Blacksburg was never on a main railroad, but in 1904, a small rail spur was constructed connecting the station in Cambria, the current site of the New River Valley Mall, to Blacksburg. The second depot, built in 1913, once stood here at the site of the municipal building. A trestle covered the intersection at Clay and Draper, and the tracks ran across Main Street. The track's original path has been replaced by the Huckleberry Trail. One of the earliest structures on this block was the Virginia House Hotel, owned by Mr. Hawley. By the 1920s, several structures had been constructed on this lot, including a garage and a fertilizer and building materials store. Known to locals as the old Annie K's building, the Bluegrass Market was built at the corner of Washington and Main in 1920. The historic building still stands, although almost unrecognizable alongside the modern building that has taken over the block. Even by 1921, this block did not contain many structures. Today, this still rings true. Small homes, houses turned businesses, and a small apartment complex occupy this block. Corner of Washington and Penn Streets, the Sheriff Camper House was built around 1872 and is still a private residence. A house identical to this one was built by Sheriff Camper's brother on Roanoke Street, just northeast of Wharton. The First Baptist Church was organized in the early 1800s and purchased this site in 1874. It was the center of an African American community that also included a nightclub, several houses, and the Blacksburg Negro School, once located across Clay Street. Rumored to host a nightclub called Moonglow, Wade Hall served as a community center for African American families that lived in the area. The building was damaged by fire in 1984 and no longer exists.